We are online.
So, good morning, everyone. Just a second. Okay. Now, good morning, everyone. My name is Janaína Carvalho. I'm assistant professor at Federal University of Minas Gerais. And today I will be the moderator of Abralin Arena C Constructions proposal for Romance language. In Abralin Arena, two specialists present their view on the same subject and receive questions from other specialists. This is then an interesting opportunity to broaden our view on a specific linguistic issue. The issue today is C constructions and the proposals for the several C constructions we have in Romance languages. Andrea Saab and Jonathan MacDonald will present their approaches to C constructions in Romance languages, and the discussants of this approach are Javier Ormazabal, Francisco Ordonez, Grant Armstrong. Before we start, I would like to thank Abralin for making this event possible. I would like to compliment the president of Abralin, Adelaide Silva, and also Maria Cristina Figueiredo Silva and Rosane Silveira for their assistance. I will start presenting the discussants. So, André Saab is an associate research at the CONICET, Conselho Nacional de Investigações Científicas e Técnicas, from Argentina, and an associate professor at University of Buenos Aires. And Jonathan MacDonald is an associate professor of linguistics and Spanish at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. André Saab will be the first presenter, and Jonathan will follow. Andres, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Janaína. Thanks, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with all these great colleagues and friends, and a special pleasure to share this Abralin Arena with Jonathan MacDonald. And so I will start sharing. That's the first step. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yeah. Okay. So today I will basically present my last stance on the issue about how many set constructions or how many set pronouns we have in Spanish and maybe in Romance. I will not introduce here new stuff, and I will open to discussion with Sean and with the colleagues. So thanks for the attention. I will just say that the talk is going to be divided in three brief parts. In the first part, I will discuss the one or many question and my reaction to it in my last works on the topic. Then I will present the basics of the theory with some illustration. And finally, I will discuss the variable and prob distinction I will make here and its impact in Romance. And that is going to be all what I have to say today. A more explicit and detailed presentation of the ideas I will comment now can be found in this paper that appeared in GLOSS in 2020. And an extension of the theory to a set of fact mainly unnoticed in the previous literature, with the exception of work by Sean, is in this paper on the relation between set construction and infinitive clauses. Okay, so you can contact me for papers and reference. Also, I will skip a lot of reference, but all the references are in these papers. Okay, so first part, the one or many question and my reaction to it. So depending on the Spanish handbook and of course of the dialect of Spanish, the clitic set is involved in at least 10 or 12 different construction quotation marks. Here's a non-exhaustive list based on the Tulio influential grammar. It's a grammar from the 90s, mainly based on my dialect. So I will follow the Tulio taxonomy and also his her terminology, right? Okay, we have. I will I will going to be fast with respect to the list of construction because I assume that you are more or less familiarized with the set of construction, maybe with the exception of one or two, which are more particular of my dialect. But again, the first one is ergative se, la tormenta del barco, the storms on the ship. We know that this transitive sentence can be, in a sense, deactivated, or the external argument can be deactivated by introducing the clitic se, and then we get the ergative se construction, like in se hundió el barco con la tormenta, the ship sank by the storm. Then we have the famous passive se construction, which give us an arbitrary reading sentence for the external argument on the basis of a maybe previous transitive sentence, like la policía cerró las puertas para bloquear la salida. From this one you can get se cerraron las puertas para bloquear la salida, meaning the door were closed in order to block the exit. In personal se, like the alternation you get in Juan criticó a Ana, Sean criticized Anna, versus se criticó a Ana with an arbitrary reading for the external argument. Reflexive se, of course, Juan criticó a Ana, Juan criticized Ana, or Ana criticized herself with the critic se again. Then we have this one, some people call it benefactive se, others call it aspectual se. For reasons I will not discuss today, is this crazy critic that apply in construction, like Juan comió la manzana, Juan ate the apple, versus Juan se comió la manzana. Here you don't have any deactivation of any argument in principle. But anyways, you can insert the critic se, and this has, as you may know, many impacts in aspectual interpretation, regarding the internal argument, and so on and so on. Then we have the beautiful inherent se, it's just a critic that appear associated with some particular predicates, all intransitive, like Juan se quejó, John complained, not Juan quejó or Juan lo quejó. Okay. Then you have the optional se with an accusative predicates mainly, like Juan murió, John died, Juan died, versus Juan se murió. O cayó una persona al río, se cayó una persona al río. This is the one that Tulio called diacritic se. In cases like Juan acordó las condiciones, John agreed to the conditions, versus Juan se acordó de Ana, John remembered Anna. This is a beautiful one. It's one that in principle doesn't doesn't change the basic balance of the predicate, but it alters the case frame of the sentence and adds new meanings related to different dimensions, not always predictable. Okay, this is one. This is a very nice one. It's particular of my dialect of the. That's it's kind of new construction. You can say in my dialect, Juan se trabajó todo, or Juan se trabajó la vida. Literally, it's Juan se worked all, or Juan se worked the life, meaning Juan worked a lot. This is the se that Angela Di Tullio calls stylistic se. O Juan se tocó todo, Juan se tocó la vida, meaning that Juan sang terrific. Beautiful one. So, as you can see, there is a chaotic, apparently chaotic diversity in the taxonomy of the construction. And the first question is, of course, the one or many questions. So how many se does Spanish and Romance in general have? And sub-question, which purposes do they serve in the clause? And my answer to the one or many question is basically divided in two parts. Two related answers. The first one is that there is only one. This is the thesis that I call the synchronic thesis, which basically is the idea that se is a mere proof for a movement. So on the theory to be presented here, both paradigmatic se, reflective, inherent, and so on, and non-paradigmatic se, impersonal, passive, receive a uniform analysis. The difference among different types being related to case agreement and other independent syntactic properties. This is related, I think, with a diachronic aspect in the evolution of Spanish clitics. And I want to conjecture that basically this proof for a movement evolved from plain pronouns, that is, from variables in the semantics. So the distinction between variables and free proofs is not always transparent, but as I will show, a brief comparison with Italian, a language in which C is still a variable, will be enough to illustrate what type of prediction and what type of Romance languages can follow under the theory I will comment now. Okay, so this is the first part. Let's go on then to a brief summary of how I propose to implement the synchronic thesis. So let's see the theory and some illustration with some basic cases in order to leave the room for opening the discussion. So the starting point, the starting assumption is that clitics can come in two guises. We have regular lexical and pronominal DPs, which are basically case phrases. They are standard case phrases in the sense that they have unvalued case feature, valued and probably interpreted file feature, and of course they are related to theta properties. Then we have a impoverished version of clitics, which is the guys that I call prop clitics, which are only D projections, minimal or maximal in Chomsky's sense. They cannot have they have unvalued file feature, also an associated EPP feature, and no theta property associated today. The idea, the following assumption is that only case heads are visible when unvalued for theta assignment. And from this, it follows that then these guys, the proclitic, cannot be related to theta roles or theta properties. Okay, that's crucial. So in a sense, that proclitics are just defective DPs. So coming back to the one or many question, how many sets does Spanish have, and that question, which purpose do they serve in the clause? Here's a more specific answer. The idea is that there is only one CPROF whose main function is relating subcategorization features of functional head. In the general case, such a functional head is voice, but there are other options like T, as we will see, and maybe other spectral heads and so on. So in tree form, this basically boils down to the idea that you merge C in a spectral phrase as a phrase, but this clitic being maximal and minimal can prove in its complement domain and attracts a relevant DP, an active one to, for instance, attracted and deleting some feature. The crucial point of this first merge stage is in the idea that this guy deletes the subcategorization property of the voice here. Okay. So with this assumption in mind, let's start with the paradigmatic case of paradigmatic C, which is of course reflexive C, one critic one and a C critic one. And here's a more explicit syntax of the construction. Okay. So the idea is again that C is merged in the voice position here. From this position, as I said, C can probe its complement domain, and if it finds active nominal argument, it attracts it to its specifier position from which the case phrase delete the EPP feature of C and receive a further and the case phrase receives and further action role from the voice here. Okay, that is the basic idea, and an instance of regular A movement. Okay. The key point here is that a reflexive syntax is one in which voice, this here, does not value accusative case. And this is the reason why the internal argument can move to the position of voice, basically because it's active in Chomsky 2000-2001 sense. Okay. So on this analysis, we have seen that the case phrase is a theta receptor, but says not, simply because, as we saw it does not project case. There is also an obvious connection between theta visibility and case activity, in the sense that absence of k-valuation in the voice domains for the relevant argument makes such an argument visible for a movement and further instances of theta assignment. Thus, in regular reflexive derived from a transitive syntax, the internal argument does not value accusative, and in part because of this, receives two theta roles, one from V, one from voice, the Asian one. And of course, it values nominative. And finally, agreeing that is the main responsible for giving us the set list of paradigmatic set, no? Depending on the properties of the internal argument. So Juan se ama, yo me amo, tú te amas, etc., etc., etc. Okay. So, okay. Okay. So what about the left part of the derivation? I'm assuming here that pronouns are semantic indexes. Now, depending on their merged position, argumental or non-argumental position, indexes trigger assignment functions, plus, of course, phi presupposition if you buy the story by Kratzer and others. Or, if they merge in non-argumental position, they trigger predicate abstraction. This last scenario results whenever an index is attached as a system of a given functional head. So you have the definition of predicate abstraction there, but the idea is very simple. If you have an index attached to a functional head or whatever here, then the instruction for ls is reading this category, this phrase as a lambda formula, right? Okay, so the idea is that clitics, when they are proof, are basically predicate makers, right? So the left counterpart of a C pronoun, sorry, as a C prob in the LF derivation is basically a lambda prefix, right? That is the idea of how LF reads the syntax of a regular C construction when the C construction is paradigmatic in the relevant sense. That is to say, when the C construction, agree applies successfully. Okay. Now, here's a paradigmatic case of non-paradigmatic C is the impersonal C construction. Juan criticó a Ana, se criticó a Ana. And the idea is very simple. The idea is that we have basically the same syntax that we saw with respect to reflexives, but in this case, voice, as you can see, is a values accusative case, and because of this, this internal argument is inactive in Chomsky sense. Then this probe here cannot value the phi features, cannot delete the EPP feature, and then a default strategy applies, giving us the flavor of non-paradigmatic set. So on this analysis, case valuation in the voice domain for the relevant argument makes such an argument invisible for further a movement and further instances of set assignment. In the sense that in a regular impersonal C construction derived from a transitive syntax, the internal argument values accusative and receives only one theta role from B. This supposes an agree failure in Preminger says, since the internal argument is inactive for further I dependencies, agree cannot resolve the unvalued phi features. And as I said, the pronoun is resolved, the probe is resolved via default strategy. And this results obviously in non-paradigmatic set. The left derivation basically consists in a correlate of this agree failure. So the lambda abstraction cannot apply for this reason, because we fail in the syntax, so we don't have a true index and a dependency with internal argument. Then existential closure applies on say self, and self is then read as an arbitrary subject, unless other syntactic operators affect interpretation of say at the left. For instance, generic ones. Okay. So this is the basic mechanics of the uniform theory of say and of frame here. I would like to briefly mention two crucial implications for the theory of non-paradigmatic set. One related to the impersonal versus passive distinction, something Jonathan is going to talk in a minute, and the other one related to the argumental versus non-argumental distinction, borrowing Cinque's original terminology. With respect to the first distinction, prima facie, passive set looks particularly challenging for the present analysis, since in the surface we see subject agreement effects, right? So we have la policía cerró las puertas, and then you see that the verb seems to syntactically agree with the subject, with the internal argument. So this could give you the impression that then you have a nominative subject, and if you have a nominative subject, I predict that this should be a reflexive syntax, not an impersonal one, but it's an impersonal one. That's important. But it turns out that there is no nominative evaluation here, and that probably these subjects are true accusative subjects. Why? Well, because they are incompatible with true nominative subject. You can say se encontraron cadáveres, bodies were found, but you cannot use proper names or true nominative subject like él. You cannot say se encontró él with the meaning of he was found.
Andreas, 5 more minutes.
Thanks. Me encontré yo with the sense of I was found. If you want to put the right pronoun or the right constituent here, you have to use dom or just make an accusative replacement. Se los encontró o se me encontró. O se encontró a Juan. Okay? With respect to the argumental versus non-argumental distinction, we have cases in which se combines with an accusative and passive predicates, also apparently challenging the approach given here. So you have the famous case of non-argumental se is one in which se combines with analytic passive, like for instance, cuando se es castigado sin razón. Cuando se es castigado sin razón, when one is punished without a reason, you have se combined with an analytic passive. Non-argumental se has two crucial properties. First, it's incompatible with episodic tenses. You cannot say ayer se fue condenado sin razón in the past, compared with a regular impersonal se construction. And second, cannot occur in non-finite absolute clauses. You cannot say al serse castigado sin razón. Compare again with a regular impersonal. Al castigarse Ana sin razón is a perfect sentence. So these two properties leads me to the idea that the syntax of non-argumental se is one in which se does not check an EPP feature, sorry, a subcategorization feature of voice, but a subcategorization feature of tense. So this is a case in which you have generic tense, finite generic tense, se inserted in the position of tense, checking the subcategorization feature and attracting an operator in the relevant syntactic position, right? That's important because this show you that the theory allows for say checking other syntactic positions. Okay. So the interim conclusion is that there is only one say, as I already said. More specifically, I divide the synchronic thesis in two. Basically, I show that say is a proof of right movement. This has an impact at the left derivation in the sense that you have two options depending on whether agree applies successfully or not. When it applies successfully, you have abstraction over individuals. When it doesn't, applied successfully, you have a default strategy and existential closure at LF. Okay. The remaining particular properties of each set construction follow them from independent structural properties regarding set assignment, case visibility, and the working of family. Okay, so there is no need to postulate different type of set pronouns. Okay, there is then an illustration of how the system derived the orders, but I don't have time for discussing these guys. You can see the paper I mentioned the beginning. I have an analysis for inherency, for ergative set, for benefative set, and so on. Okay. So let me just concluding this presentation by a brief remark on the diachronic thesis. You remember that I conjectured that the Spanish se evolved from plain pronouns, that is, variables in the semantics. And as I said, the distinction is not always transparent, but a brief comparison with Italian should give us the flavor of the conjecture. Okay, the idea is this. The idea is that some pronouns evolve as pros, and this has a consequence, an impact at the left derivation, in which an index subject to an assignment function changed for a lambda abstract. That's the basis, right? So the idea is that the clitics can come into cases depending whether or not variables evolve as pros. You can have clitics as D projection or clitic as case projection. This is basically the thesis put in a schematic form. Okay. One crucial test, and that's my conclusion, one crucial test to know whether some pronouns or variables have evolved to a prob abstractor is provided by doubling. So I conjecture that those pronominal constructions that allow for doubling are those in which the doubling element is a prob. Consider in this respect how reflexive doubling works in Italian and Spanish. As you might know, Italian is a language in which there is no doubling in general, but there is no reflexive doubling usually. So you can say Gianni difende se stesso, Gianni se difende, but not Gianni se difende se stesso. Compared with the Spanish, in which doubling of reflexive is productively attested. And as it was in well, absence of doubling is for me an indication that the reflexive pronoun is still a pronoun. And this means basically having a regular transitive sentence with the clitic in the internal argumentative position working as a regular variable in the semantics. Okay. Whereas in Spanish, as we saw, the clitic evolved as a prob, it's here, then the doubling is predicted, and the rest of the remainder of the derivation is already known for you. Okay, so final remark, besides its apparently chaotic diversity, the clitic set is theoretically tractable as a single syntactic object, namely as a formal prob. In the semantics, this single object, is read as an abstractor, a predicate maker, or as a sort of indefinite depending on conditions that are determined at syntax. These conditions, essentially activity and locality, are well known in other domains of the system, so they don't need to be stipulated by ad hoc premises. And finally, the theory is committed to a particular research agenda according to which the origins of formal probes must be found in the diachronic evolution of pronouns. These steps goes from their interpretation as variables to their contribution to as mere lambda abstract. If this conjecture turned out to be correct, we would have made a step forward in our understanding of the complexities that motivate the so-called TPP property and its connection to a movement in natural language. Muito obrigado, muchas gracias, many thanks, and sorry for the running.
Okay, thank you, Andres. So now Jonathan will present his work. And Jonathan, you have 27 minutes.
Okay, thank you. That should be plenty. Let's see if this, okay. Well, first of all, thank you to the Abralin organizer, and especially Janaina for putting this together. and Andres for agreeing, and of course the discussants, Javier, Grant, and Paco. I'm sorry, Roberta can't be here. And as Andres mentioned, I will be talking about one of these says, or two of them, I guess, so-called impersonal and passive, these non-paradigmatic. And the question I want to ask is whether or not the impersonal say and passive say is somehow syntactically different. One way in which they're typically distinguished is in terms of agreement. And I give you a simple example there. In one, where you see in 1A, so-called impersonal say, and the overt DP is plural, but there's no agreement with the verb. And in passive say, the DP is plural, and you apparently see agreement with the verb. And so the question is, can we distinguish these? Because if, as our, Andres just mentioned, and others here suggest that in Spanish, at least, you really don't have syntactic agreement. So can we distinguish these two? That is it won't let me advance. There we go. So I have two answers to that question, yes and no. So what I'd like to argue is that if we can say that say heads different functional projections, that's what you see in 2. So in 2A, for impersonal say heading T, and then 2B for passive say heading voice, and we'll talk about more details, then yes, we can distinguish them syntactically. However, if we treat say as an independent pronoun, a full phrase, then the answer is no. And ultimately that would reduce to a single say with respect to impersonal and passive say. So some arguments for different functional heads, I'm going to make reference to case, differential object marking, predicate class restrictions, and the status of being consistent null subject language. So first, case, assuming basic probe-goal relationship that underlies agreement, as well as case, following Chomsky, what I would say is arguably standard. We can assume that a DP that agrees with voice is accusative, and a DP that agrees with T should be nominative. And I give you an illustration of impersonal say in 4A here. And the idea is that if say heads this T functional projection, or the spell out of a certain set of features, it's interacting with the properties of T and can very well absorb nominative case. And that's used informally, absorb. And this essentially is what I believe Dobro Sorin is trying to say by calling impersonal say nominative say. And since it's in T, of course, it doesn't necessarily have to interact with the properties of voice, and therefore accusative case is available on that overt DP, as illustrated there. And in 4B, a passive say, assuming it heads voice, again, can interact with the properties, absorb accusative case, and therefore the only syntactic relation would be with T, and we would get nominative. And this is pretty standard or traditional, I would say. And there is support for this. First example from Roberta's dissertation here, where you can see in 5A, an impersonal or nominative say, the two pronouns are plural, there's no agreement on the verb, and the only one that seems to be available is the accusative pronoun there. And that contrasts with 5B, the passive or accusative say, where your pronouns are plural, the verb is plural, and you can see that, in fact, the pronoun is a nominative, as expected on the story. And here I'm leaving Romance a little bit, and just wanted to make reference to Slovenian, and we'll come back around the Polish as well. Slavic shows case distinctions on full nouns as well, and you can see this when it's different says. So in personal say, and nominative say in 6A, parents is plural, you don't see agreement with the verb, and that surfaces an accusative. And in 6B, you have passive or accusative say, parents again is plural, but it agrees with the verb in plural, and you see nominative case. And this is what you would expect on the story of personal say heading T and passive say heading voice. Now turning to differential object marking, and here we're contrasting Spanish versus Romanian, and a lot of this work relies on Dobroi Sorin's work, who claims that Romanian only has passive or accusative say. And one observation that she makes to distinguish Romanian from Spanish is that the says, when you use a say in a sentence, one of these, the passive say, then you can't use the differential object marker either. And that's what you see in 7a there. And it's well known that in Spanish, of course, you can, and that's what you see in 7b. You can use the differential object marker with the say construction. And on this story, how does that explain? Well, if you assume that Dom is an object relation, it could be either agree with the voice head or perhaps a movement relationship. The idea is that, as illustrated in 8a, if your passive say is on voice and eliminates this object relation with voice with a DP, then you're only allowed a syntactic relationship with T, but that's not an object relation, it's more of a subject relation. And therefore in Romanian, you don't have Dom available with these say constructions. In 8b, assuming that, again, within personal or nominative say heads T, again, it doesn't affect the properties of voice, and that you can establish the object relation and get DOM as you do in Spanish. Now it's turning to predicate class restrictions, again, relying on work by Dobroi Sorin. She's observed that Romanian say cannot appear with copular verbs, and that's what you see in 8a, or the paraphrastic passive, as you can see in 8b. And I'll note here that Ribeiro has illustrated this for Bulgarian too. So in these respects, the Bulgarian and Romanian pattern the same, apparently only having passive say, and this allows it to appear with a copy on the paraphrastic passive. But of course, we also know that in Spanish, it can appear with your copular, as in 9a here, seas feliz or no seas feliz, or in 9b with the paraphrastic passive. And of course, as Andres illustrated earlier, Spanish isn't alone in this respect. Italian, European, and Brazilian Portuguese, as well as Polish and Slovenian, allow their say constructions with the copular and paraphrastic passive. So what kind of explanation can we provide in the context of two functional projections? It's what you have illustrated here in 10a and 10b. So again, the idea of say heads this T phrase, the T head, it's outside of the verb phrase, and being outside of the verb phrase, it's insensitive to argument structure properties, so it doesn't necessarily interact with them, and therefore allows for a greater freedom of predicate classes, as we saw in Spanish and other languages. In contrast, passive say, heading voice, is within the verb phrase, and therefore could interact with the argument structure properties and put restrictions on the type of predicates that can occur with that say. And that's what we saw with Romanian and Bulgarian. Now turning to the consistent null subject status of a language and the relationship with personal say and nominative say. The idea is that I'd like to put forth is that only languages that are consistent null subject will develop or have an impersonal or nominative say. And there has been assumptions regarding the relationship between being a pro-job language and having a personal say, and I give you some references there, but I don't think it's been fully explored. So here's some languages that are consistent null subject languages and have impersonal say. That's Spanish, Italian, European Portuguese, Polish, and Slovenian. And non-consistent null subject languages that don't have impersonal say, but they do have different says. They just don't have this impersonal one that we're discussing here. Conservative French, German, Russian, and Icelandic. And I'll assume an account of consistent null subject languages as espoused in Holmberg and subsequent work of that, in which there's this D feature in T, specifically this unvalued D feature, as you can see in 17 here. And the role of that unvalued D feature in T is that there's an agree relation with an aboutness shift topic a la Frescarelli. And via that agree relation, the unvalued D feature gets valued with a referential index. And then via agree between T and pro and spec voice, pro receives a referential index and making it a referential pro. And so the idea that I'd like to put forth here, which kind of emerged with out of the book from Grant and I, 2021, is that impersonal say or nominative say heading T essentially heads this T that has a valued D feature. And the idea here is that's going to block, since it's already valued, it's going to block this agree relationship with aboutness shift topic, and that's what's illustrated in 18 there. And since it blocks this relationship, pro and spec voice will not get a referential index, and so you'll have a non-referential pro. And so the idea here is that this consistent no subject status of language plays a role with respect to the features in T, and if a language has impersonal say, but then loses this UD feature in T, then it's also going to lose impersonal say. And in this context, I'd like to talk about Caribbean varieties of Spanish, who have, as you are it's fairly well known at this stage, that they are losing their consistent no subject status, or have actually already lost it. And I'm going to focus on one variety, and this is Puerto Rican Spanish, and explicitly the chapter from Tithio 2018, where she provides a lot of contrastive evidence between Puerto Rican Spanish and Peninsular Spanish. And I just give you two pieces of data here, where she shows that Puerto Rican Spanish appears to be losing its consistent no subject status. So in 18, you have a sentence where you see the repetition of the subject pronoun yo, no puedo, yo, which is fine in Puerto Rican Spanish, but less felicitous in Peninsular Spanish. You wouldn't repeat it as much. This is kind of a classic illustration of what happens when a language starts losing its consistent no subject status. You use more overt pronouns. And in 19, another difference that she notes is that an overt subject pronoun embedded clause can be bound by a quantifier in the matrix clause under normal stress and intonation. So that's fine in Puerto Rican Spanish, but we know that in Peninsular Spanish, that maybe if ellos is emphatic, that's fine, but under normal stress and intonation, that's no good. In Tithio's conclusion there at the bottom of the slide is that Puerto Rican Spanish is losing its UD feature in T. And we asked Puerto Rican Spanish speakers, about 7 of them, and about say with differential object marking, with the copula, and paraphrastic passive, and the majority of them did not like them, and that's what the percentage sign indicates. The majority didn't like them, but some did, importantly. And then Matthew Maddox and I went too far here. Let me go back. We did a search on Corpus del Español Now to compare Peninsular Spanish and Puerto Rican Spanish, first with DOM, and you can see 21A. We found 169 tokens for Peninsular Spanish, but 21 tokens for Puerto Rican Spanish. For the copulate, 310 tokens for Peninsular, 1 for Puerto Rican Spanish, and for the paraphrastic passive, 41 tokens for Peninsular Spanish and 4 for Puerto Rican Spanish. And the idea here is that it seems that, in fact, yes, the impersonal is used less in Puerto Rican Spanish than in Peninsular Spanish, and we would relate that to the change that's affecting the features of T. So just an interim conclusion with respect to the different functional heads. If, as in 22, if impersonal or nominative say heads T, the idea is accusative is available on DP, your differential object marker is available, you're not going to have predicate class restrictions, and there appears to be an interaction with being a consistent no subjects language. In contrast, passive say as heading voice, well, nominative is available on DP, differential object marking is not available, and you have these predicate class restrictions since it's lower within the verb phrase. Okay, now turning to say as an independent pronoun, let me draw attention to one well-known salient interpretation of both impersonal say and passive say that's been noted in the literature, and this is the interpretation of an indefinite human. And here I talk about external argument position. I'm just limiting myself to these transitive constructions for now. And I'd like to suggest that on the account where say heads T, and say head's voice, the question arises, well, how do you get that interpretation? And I would propose that, well, there's some null pronoun in the specifier voice that would take on that indefinite human interpretation here. And so if say were not a functional projection, but an independent pronoun, you might think that it would be interpreted as the external argument here in specifier voice, something that has been proposed in other work. And if so, I suggest as well, well, as a pronoun and specifier voice, then it would establish your agree relationship with T, and as you would expect in a normal transitive sentence. And then the direct object DP or the theme or whatever its role is would agree with voice. And the implication I'd like to say is that, well, there would only be one say construction. It would just look like impersonal say or nominative say, passive say or accusative say would be lost. And here's where I'll transition to Polish and say the Polish, on this account, illustrates this. So first, it's been known for some time that Polish lost their passive or accusative say by the 19th century, although it still retains impersonal or nominative say. And I'll just mention that Slovenian, as I mentioned earlier, actually has both of them still. So I give you an example of the impersonal say, the nominative say in 26 here, where you see parrot, which is feminine, singular accusative. It doesn't show agreement with the verb. The verb has a neuter agreement in Polish. Your subjects tend to agree in gender as well. And that's what you see in 26b. That's ungrammatical, no longer tested in Polish, your so-called passive say, where parrot here is feminine, singular, nominative, and it shows that agreement with the verb. So it looks like, yes, Polish has lost its passive say, it has impersonal say. And so the question is Polish sh an independent pronoun? First, just I should mention that these say constructions in Polish, they share a lot of properties of Romance say, and this Rivero has written several papers on this to show that. And of course, one of them is this indefinite human interpretation as well. There are some differences. And so, for instance, we know in Italian, in these say constructions, reflexives can be bound. Polish is also like that, but what we're looking at here in 27 and 28 is not just a reflexive anaphor, but a possessive reflexive, which Polish allows in these say constructions. So you can bind oneself here or oneself's friends. And that in 28 is illustrating that you can't in Italian. And so here the idea is that, well, maybe it is the case that Polish has more of a complete feature set than Italian, for instance, and even Spanish, which doesn't really seem to be able to bind reflexives at all. More importantly, however, I would say for determining whether Polish sh is an independent pronoun, perhaps like a full phrase, is its freedom of movement or its ability to appear in different positions in the sentence. And I'm just going to read some statements that talk about Polish pronominal clitics in general. So the first one is from Anderson, 1991. He says, they enjoy almost as much freedom as non-clitic pronominals in other languages. And the next one is from Franks and King, 2000. The pronominal clitics in Polish act like full noun phrases. And so I give you two examples of the impersonal say, the sh in 29a and 29b. And the three repetitions there to indicate that they're grammatical in each of those, not that they can all appear at once. There are restrictions, for instance, that say cannot, or that sh cannot be at the beginning of the sentence. And so this sh enjoys freedom like a full noun phrase. Another set of facts that suggest that sh does not have a tight syntactic relation with the verb is in coordination. So under coordination, as you can see in 30a and 30b, say can appear in the first conjunct, but it doesn't have to appear in the second conjunct. So you have the verb sit with say, which is not inherently reflexive like Spanish, and then chatted with say. You don't have to have say there in the second conjunct, but you can. And 30b is just another example that's attested in the literature. It's a little bit strange because it's talking about barking, and there you're forced to get an interpretation of humans barking. And what you see in 31 is that that's not possible with say constructions in Spanish. So en la fiesta se juega juegos y bailo mucho. You need your say there for the personal interpretation. Again, consistent with the idea that in these cases, say is more intimately related syntactically to the verb, but not necessarily in Polish. So the upshot of this is that there does seem to be evidence that Polish sh is an independent pronoun, a full phrase. There's a wider number of syntactic positions that can occur in. There's no need to repeat under coordination. And if so, we can put it in this external argument position, and then it would establish an agreement relation with T, nominative, and then voice would be open. And the implication, of course, there would be only one say construction, and personal say or nominative say, and passive say was lost. So in this context, I would like to make a speculation about Brazilian Portuguese. And I should stress that this is speculative at this point. I haven't fully looked at, I haven't answered all questions, but here we go. So it's known that Brazilian Portuguese has lost passive or accusative say, at least starting in the 1700s, but completely lost by 1900s. But it retains its impersonal or nominative say, which it may also be losing at this stage. So in this respect, it looks like Polish. So the speculative idea is that, well, Brazilian Portuguese lost this passive or accusative say because say itself became more phrasal. And this may be related to the emergence of weak pronominals as discussed for some time as in Kate and Cato. Just as one piece of evidence that is consistent with this idea, but there's still questions. This is from Nunes's master's thesis in 33A. You can see a coordinated structure here with an impersonal say, but it doesn't have to be repeated, but you can, as in 33B there. And so if these are taken as facts that the say constructions or the say itself doesn't have such an intimate relationship with the verb, then they're pointing in that direction, or at least consistent with this speculative idea. Okay, so just to conclude by a brief recap here, the main question I wanted to ask is, are impersonal say and passive say somehow different syntactically? And I wanted to say that yes, if say heads different functional projections, such as in Spanish, Italian, European, Portuguese, and Slovenian, you can see these differences emerge, specifically if personal say or nominative say heads T, and if passive say or accusative say heads voice. However, if say is an independent pronoun, it would be in the specifier voice, and you wouldn't have these syntactic differences necessarily between impersonal and passive say. You would only have this impersonal nominative say, and I would suggest that Polish is a good candidate for that, and possibly Brazilian Portuguese with further investigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think we will start with Javier or Mazabal. I think I hope the pronunciation is correct. So Javier Mazabal is a professor in the Department of Linguistics and Basque Studies at the University of the Basque Country. So thank you, Javier, for your participation here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you to both of you for these excellent presentations. Well, actually, I had two questions, both of them directed to both of you, but I framed them so that Andres, I will frame it, the first one for Andres and the second one for Jonathan. But I go back to frame one single question for both of you, because Jonathan, in some sense, John's presentations made me change my mind, because I expected something different from John's work, previous work on the different sets and so on. So let me try to frame the question common to both of you in some sense. The question is very general. It's what kind of computational component are we heading in both cases? To make it more specific. It seems to me, for instance, that John's work in the different sets and so on, and only taking into consideration the say as a head in different places, okay, and not only passive and impersonal, but more generally the work you have done on the causative inchoative alternation and things like that. Okay. Now, what kind of grammar do you vision? I have the impression that Jonathan's vision is a little bit more. It is the lexical properties of say, the different lexical properties of the different says that combined with the properties of the different inflectional heads somehow are giving you the differences between the two different says. That is my impression, but you could elaborate on that, because with the combination with the pronominal and so on, that makes things a little bit complicated. In the case of Andres, okay, if say is a single say, my question is, where do you put the weight of the difference between the ones? In some cases, it is clear that, for instance, you are postulating, for instance, for the benefactive, you are postulating an applicative head, an applicative projection that is not in the other, so you have some structural difference. But the main discussion you have is related to the say impersonal, say passive, and on the other hand, the say reflexive. And in principle, in the article, you give basically the same structural basis, making the difference probably in the properties of the voice. And I want to see how do you think about it? In some sense, what I mean is, are you transferring the differences that some other people would postulate in the say to the voice or to the T or whatever it is? Or you think more in terms of some construction-like properties, more general in the structure, that emerge and give you some differences between, say, for instance, in personal say or passive say and say reflexive say, and so on and so forth. And related to that, actually, it's a question to both of you, which is how do you well, actually, Jonathan has answered part of the question. My question is, how do you frame how do you connect the historical evolution of say in Romance and probably in Slavic as well, with the possible differences between the languages in some way? So it's a very general question. You can answer it or not. I mean, it's up to you guys. And thank you very much. It's been a very, 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 very good experience. Thank you very much.
Andres, you want to go first?
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Javi. So there are two questions, right? Yeah. With respect to the first one, which is the difference between, I think, that the paradigmatic and not paradigmatic cases, like impersonal versus reflexive, let's say. Yeah, I put a minimal difference in voice, which is the possibility of valuing or not valuing accusative. And this is a minimal difference that is really dramatic. And it's really dramatic because it triggers a frozen effect for the internal argument. And it makes agree between the internal argument and say impossible. And it has an important consequence in the morphological derivations, in the sense that it gives you the difference between paradigmatic and non-paradigmatic as a mere failure of agree. But I think that that's the novel point of my proposal. It also gives you the semantic derivation, because this failure of agree, it has also an impact on the left, right? In the sense of giving you now a difference between being a lambda prefix, I mean, a predicate maker in the case in which agree applies successfully, and an indefinite or some sort of arbitrary subject in the case of impersonal say. So it's a minimal difference which really trigger a cascade of dramatic stuff, right? I did also a brief modification with respect to my previous stuff, mainly based in your findings and findings by John related to the activity of this set or I mean the syntactic activity. So I think that once you put this prop in the syntax proper, and then you manipulate the feature of voice as suggested, then I think that the main difference regarding the morphological shape of the construction and the interpretation facts really follows, assuming, as I'm assuming, the idea that syntax produces allocence, right? The idea that some object get different interpretation depending on what syntax do with these objects. I don't know, Javi, if I answer the main. So yeah,
Yeah, actually, that was a good answer.
Okay, so it's a minimal difference with a dramatic. I like the idea of just a minimal differences exploiting the differences. And as for the second question, which is variation, in the Romance domain, I have only I didn't think about Polish or non-Romance languages. In the Romance domain, I see that the theory is flexible for accounting for various differences. One is related to the distinction I made between languages in which se is still a pronoun, and I think that this is, in a sense, suggested by Sean, but for different languages. But I think, for instance, that you can think of Italian as a language in which C is still a variable, not a prof. As it's still a variable, you predict absence of doubling on the one hand, but you also predict some co-occurrence between personal and reflexive. So reflexive C is still a pronoun, then it can combine, for instance, with other type of impersonal subjects, like in the famous GC construction analyzed by Cinque and others, and so on. As for the difference between null subject and non-null subject languages, I think that the story will run very similar to Jonathan, because I will put the difference on the properties of state self, saying that, for instance, in those languages in which tense requires us an XP, like EPP languages, then C is not going to do the job of canceling, of satisfying that requirement, and so on. I don't have still a good answer for Romanian. It's a very, very very old problem, standing problem. Sean has a really nice answer to why, but I have my reservation with respect to the notion of case absorption, of course, and I have a reservation with respect to the idea that in passive se, the subject is nominative. At least I think that in Spanish it's not, but it can be in other languages, I don't know. So I think that the theory really has an agenda to propose, right? Not a definite answer, of course, but I think that there is room. I think that the problem is that there is some misunderstanding in the idea that you, for instance, in approaches like mine, you really does not account for the difference, right? I'm just saying that I'm not going to put the variation action on say itself, but of course, many factors like agree, null subject properties, and so on will interact to give you different sort of Romance languages. At this moment in particular, I'm particularly interested in the difference between the variable se and non-variable se, which I think that it really bears on what Jonathan says about having real pronouns or true pronouns as versus having just a prof, right? I don't know if I answered the two questions, Javi.
Yeah. Very well.
Thank you, sir. Gracias,
Javi. Yes. So yes, I did throw in non-romance, and so this is really, and it emerged in large part because of the book that Grant and I put out in this question about whether the say is a pronoun or whether it is a functional head. And of course, if you look at a lot of analyses of Spanish and Italian and the Romance language, you see both. And so the desire was try to pin down at least some kind of argumentation to be able to distinguish them. And so, yeah, maybe, so it did emerge from previous work, but not quite in this form. And then so the question about the vision of the computational system. Well, I think that at least what Andres presented, especially when it comes to the the question of a full pronoun or a variable versus a head, or that leads to a lambda abstraction, a phi probe. I think there's something to that, and this relates arguably to diachronic processes as well, just general processes where we know that subject pronouns, for instance, become reanalyzed as part of the verb. And I think really ultimately that's what is happening, and what we're looking at is different stages of that. And it's a complex relationship between something, some pronoun, and I'll just pick on T, for instance, right? And so they're sharing features via agree, and you can analyze the source of those features as somebody's learning as, oh, it's T itself, that's where the pronoun is, right? Or it's, oh no, that's this a thing that's external or different, a pronoun, that's where the pronoun is, in the specifier of TP, for instance. And so you get this continual exchange, I would say, or what Van Gelderen might call a cycle. And so I think a lot of variation comes simply from that. And I would agree that a lot of it has to do with the lexical properties of the elements in combination to whether it's actually a full pronoun or heads a particular functional projection. Yeah, I'm not sure. Did that answer your question as well?
I think that answered both questions at the same time. So,
and I would also
you can add any.
Yeah, so actually, now that I wanted to add something else, and it has to do with Spanish, and actually the discussions that both of yours work, illuminated to me the fact that it looks like it's not really syntactic agreement what's happening in Spanish, which is completely possible. And I think that at least it's consistent. There's a place for it in the story that I outlined. Historically, diachronically, and what would I say? Well, possibly what's happening is, well, these heads are becoming more pronominal, or they're at a stage where possibly people just aren't sure whether they are functional heads or pronouns, and that affects agreement possibilities, right? But it would be possibly en route to, perhaps becoming more pronominal, or maybe they're at a stage where they're just going to be variable like that. That's what I would say about that. But yes, so thank you.
Thank you to both of you.
So thank you, Javier. So to continue our discussion now, Grant Armstrong will be the discussant. He's an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And thank you. Thank you, Grant, for your participation today.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks, Andres and John, for the great presentations. My question is actually a specific empirical question about a class of predicates that have been observed to resist this non-argumental or impersonal say, the basically psych verbs like gustar. This observation has been in the literature for a while, and I think most recently in Paco Ordóñez's paper, he mentions that the internal nominative theme or stimulus argument of verbs like gustar, it basically can never appear as impersonal say. So something like the intention, we said something like se gusta or se me gusta, being I like people or people please me. Same with something like molestar, something like se molesta, people bother in general. We just don't see it with those particular verbs. And even though it is a specific question, I think both of your stories, there's a way of probably explaining that restriction. I think it's an interesting empirical question for everybody working on this topic. What is it about those, the class 3 psych predicates in Belletti and Rizzi's classification of those that resists this impersonal say, where we see it in pretty much every other type of verbal predicate. And, you know, if we think of it as that say is sort of high in the structure, we wouldn't necessarily predict that. But there's other reasons because of the data of experiencer that might be able to explain it. So I was interested, you know, for both of you, the question is a general question. What are your thoughts on that particular class of predicates, and sort of how would you extend your respective systems in order to account for that restriction? I'll stop there.
John?
I was hoping you were going to go first. Well, that is a great question. And truth be told, I haven't really thought in any deep sense about what a good answer is. But I would rely on Paco's work in terms of perhaps it's just something relating it. You have to be high enough in the structure, and there can't be something that potentially could intervene between, you know, that say element and and T, for instance, and perhaps that dative does that. Although I haven't worked out any details in terms of you know, how that actually plays out, but that is at least how I'd begin to approach it. But I think you're also right to point out that you might expect that, given, especially in the context of what I said about predicate classes and personal say, being able to appear with all of them, not going to interact. Perhaps this is one of those areas in which it does interact because of some, you know, more specific properties of the construction. But I don't have too many more insights about that. Andres?
I'm more or less in the same situation. Okay, thanks, Grant, for the question. I think that let me just introduce my answer in the following observation. There is according to my position, there is a clear, there are, I mean, predicate restrictions, right? As far as I can tell, non-argumental say is broadly more restricted than non-argumental say. It only appears in generic tenses, finite clauses, and impossibly non-finite clauses, and so on. So it's really a complex guy, and there is not too much inside still. I mean, besides Cinque stuff, so a lot of work to do with respect to distinction between argumental and non-argumentals. So I don't expect a combination between impersonal say and third class predicates just because of the properties of voice. What I do expect maybe is non-argumental say combined with those predicates. So that's an excellent question. Why you cannot combine non-argumental say in generic, finite, and blah, 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 something like se gusta, whatever. And I think that the property could be related to what happened in non-null subject languages, in the sense that maybe connected what the suggestion that Sean made, is that there are properties of tense here. As I said, non-argumental say is a property of tense, not a property of voice. But third-class predicates require maybe dative subjects. So then there is an incompatibility between expected position, in the sense that you cannot put together the operator I postulate and the dative subject. You know, if you buy that idea that dative argument, the experiencer, are specifiers of T, then I think that I predict that incompatibility. But I never thought on this. So I am in the same situation that John. I think that is a great question, but maybe it's really a good feedback for trying to see if I can check this story about having a say on T. So maybe it's a prediction, but I don't want to be so optimistic, of course. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think the question was mainly about I think it's an area that you can test your
Exactly.
respective theories
Yeah,
and see, and you could
Exactly.
probably say something interesting about that data of
Yeah,
experiencer and how it interacts with
it's
with the
really
say. Yeah.
great feedback, really great feedback. Thank you.
So I should mention that Roberta D'Alessandro is on YouTube and she has a take on this. She said that sight verbs and C constructions are the same constructions and they also they also go hand in hand with auxiliaries. So she would contribute enormously for us being here today. But unfortunately, something happened. Now to finish our discussion, we have Francisco Ordóñez. He's a professor in the Department of Linguistics at Stony Brook University. Thank you, Paco, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Janaina, and the exponents. It was a great discussion and great talks about the different issues about same and personal say. So, and many issues have come up already in the Javier and Grant questions. And I think, as you point out, the main issue here is to deal with one of the most intriguing things about this construction is to deal with variability that we find in all these Romance languages, and in terms of interpretation and in terms of case. So I'm going to center on the question of interpretation because I've worked on this a little bit more, and I always, since Cinque, I always been not happy with the idea that Italian and Catalan would be put together with Italian versus Romanian. And for the one of the main reasons having to do with the possible first plural interpretation of impersonal say in Italian. So if you watch an Italian movie in Italian and see the subtitles in Spanish, you'll see that many of the C things that you hear in the Italian movie in Italian, they translated them as a first person plural. So that's an interesting semantic. There are many examples. So my question is, how is a general question, and you both have provided different theoretical implementations of how the different say works in your work. So how does that, the fact that you have that possibility in Italian much more spread out than in Italian and in Catalan, how is it implemented in your theory? So that's a general, well, and also that interpretation doesn't have, which is related to the question by Grant Armstrong, that interpretation doesn't have the kind of argument. There is one thing in the say construction, which is some say constructions or some say interpretation are sensitive to the argument structure, as you have mentioned. Sensitive of the argument structure and the tense properties of that. And that first person plural interpretation doesn't seem to have those. So you can have it with an accusative in past tense, present, and future, no problems. But if you get into this so-called true impersonal say construction, then, or the more impersonal interpretation, then you do have, at least in Spanish, clear restrictions on the argument structure and on the tense properties. And also that brings me to the second question is about whether you, well, I guess I'm kind to the idea that say is always doubling something, but I guess depending on your perspective, you don't agree with that, I assume. And whether there is an empty argument there, because in Jonathan's work, you propose that there is evidence of that empty, of having an empty element in the related to say, which binds inalienable possessor construction. So given that argument, you think that thing works also with impersonal say and with passive say, or or I don't know. I have a I have that as a question. And there is also a third question, but I don't know. It probably will bring us to which is the interaction of say with Dom, which is a very complex thing. Because I want to bring just this detail into the discussion, which is Catalan, which has no Dom, officially has no Dom. It's much more restricted Dom. Does allow Dom with impersonal say included. So it is a very surprising fact that a language like, that you don't have Dom with, you have a normal predicate when you have an impersonal say, and then you put the element, then the element might have Dom. So something is going on there, but just throwing that, if you have any ideas. Okay, and that's all I have to ask.
Andres, would you like to?
I think that you have a more specific question, right? No. One of the questions is just for you, it could be?
Oh,
yes,
yes,
about the inalienable possession. You, in your paper, you show that.
I agree with that. Look, if you compare, I guess, the anticausatives with these other impersonal passives, which seem to, and the paraphrastic passive, you're able to license the interpretation, a body part interpretation, right? And the idea is that, well, if it would only relied on that morpheme say itself, it's not clear why you'd have this difference ultimately. And so that based on that, the idea is that, yes, you have some kind of null pronoun there in conjunction with, a functional say on some functional head, and that is what's responsible for, licensing the body part interpretation. And I mean, then I go on with Matthew Maddox and we try to discuss that interaction between that pronoun that's null, its features, and the features on the head itself, and to try to account for availability of by phrases and how they were lost. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, that how it works.
I'm asking about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean,
that would only apply for the passive then.
No, I mean, I think it would apply for both impersonal and passive, right? Even though say is on different functional heads, at least in the recent stuff, the pronoun would still be there, and that's what
in both. Okay.
Yeah, the pronoun would be there for both.
So it was okay. To clarify, you would always have an empty pronoun, even if it's impersonal or.
Yeah. So,
okay.
Right, in conjunction with properties of certain functional heads.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Since my mic is on, regarding the first the first person plural interpretation, I think those are fascinating facts, and in fact I have thought about that a little bit, and I kind of relate it to how I discuss being a consistent null subject language and having this impersonal say, and what personal say does. The idea is that based on this Holmberg type of approach to being consistent null subject language, where you have the T head, which has this UD feature. If, as I'm saying, somehow say blocks that, right, or changes that feature to valued, and therefore you get non-referential interpretation, one might think along the lines of subject cycles, in which pronouns are external to verbal inflection. They become reanalyzed as part of the verb, and once they become reanalyzed, they tend to lose features, right? And more specifically, on Van Gelderen's cycle, she would, before losing the feature, you might think that, or she might propose that it goes from interpretable to uninterpretable, or valued to unvalued. And in conjunction with being in a consistent null subject, there's nothing, as far as I know, that indicates Italian's is changing somehow from being a consistent null subject language to a non-consistent null subject language. Assuming say has this property where typically it's just a value D, you might reanalyze it as losing a property, changing from D to unvalued D head, therefore allowing referential interpretations on this Holmberg type of count. But then they raise the question, that doesn't explain why first plural though. And there I would appeal to the properties of either, well, maybe that null pronoun or say itself. I'm not sure where I would locate them, but probably the null pronoun. In terms of its features, right? Either have, like D'Alessandro's work, it has all the conjunction of first, second, third person, all the features, or perhaps it's just underspecified altogether. I mean, I think it does have person features, and the limitation to humans, I believe, possibly, I haven't worked out in detail, but I think it could be just related to the fact that these say constructions require a discourse participant.
Mhm.
And as soon as you do that, it's going to be a person. And there's a lot of discussion about, you know, barking, and you don't use say in barking context, right? Because humans don't bark typically. However, as soon as you direct your, you know, vision at an animal and say, no, aquí no se ladra, that's improved. You made the animal discourse participant, possibly. So combining the fact that maybe there's a featural change in which you become unvalued, allowing referential interpretations, with the fact that possibly being discourse participant requires first and second persons, you might be able to then, next step, get a first person plural interpretation. So I would suggest that's maybe the next stage. Would Spanish be going there? Possibly. And some of I'm sorry, I think it's de Benito. She's got some observations about Peninsular Spanish. Like one of the titles of one of her articles is se escondíamos, blah, 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 which would suggest that there too, the features of say are kind of being lost as maybe the next step when things, and then you open up more referential interpretations. And I think the first plural is possibly arguably related to this fact that say requires a discourse participant, although it's a non-referential one, you know, maybe like a fake indexical or something, as they call them. And so going to the Catalan DOM, and so let me get the facts straight first, that in Catalan, they don't have DOM, only in city constructions, and they allow clitic there.
Okay, let me be more specific. So whenever you have a verb with an object which is animate, you don't have, except for pronouns, let's leave aside pronouns, you don't have differential object marking. So I saw Mary is like in English. But if I use the say construction, then I can, well, there is, you use the clitic, then you have to have a differential object marking with so it seems like you are like right dislocating, or have to right dislocate or left dislocate the subject, the object, and you can make it
I see.
into, so you don't have the chance to not do, if you put the clitic, there's a correlation between putting the clitic and having differential object marking in a language that, you know, why wouldn't you be able, like in Italian, to do it without the differential object marking?
Right, and that only happens with the say, you're saying. Yeah, that's, I don't have an answer to that. It's an interesting fact for sure. I mean, I guess if it wouldn't be inconsistent with, I believe either of our approaches to impersonal say. No. Right, but it doesn't explain why in that case that's available. Yeah, I don't have a good answer. I haven't thought about that.
Yeah, it depends on what the analysis of differential object marking.
That would play a role as well. Yeah. Maybe Andres can illuminate us with that.
No. Sorry, I didn't get back on the fact. Can you put an example of the Catalan fact? So you have a right dislocation then with impersonal say. I didn't get the fact.
So you in Catalan you say I see Mary, like with a differential object marking. But in the moment that in the context of impersonal say, there is a distinction in Spanish and like in Spanish, and contrary to Italian, between possible objects that could be objects that are animate versus objects that are inanimate. Okay, and that distinction is the following. Then when the object is inanimate, you would have impersonal say without anything else, without clitic or anything, just the thing. But when it's animate, okay, when it's animate, you, contrary to Italian, you can have the clitic, se la ve, you know, and then in that case, usually when you have that object, you have to have differential object marking. So the differential object marking reemerges only in the context of these constructions,
Okay.
and only.
But no, you cannot say se vio a María. You have to say se la
Right, you
vio.
cannot say that. You cannot say that.
Okay.
May I say something?
So yeah.
See,
Okay.
because this is also related to the context that you guys have discussed, where non-leísta dialects do have le in the second section.
Right.
So it's exactly in those contexts where you have se le vio a María in dialects where nobody would say, I mean, where no leis involved.
Right. That's right. And what is the answer?
So then the basic facts are that inanimates, fine, but once it's animate, DOM obligatory. With the say, couldn't this be consistent with what Andres and Javier have been saying, that there's no agreement really at all, and we just have there's no so-called passive say in Catalan, and the marker comes out precisely to indicate that say is subject-like.
Yeah.
I mean, a very informal
I would
way
say
to think about it.
I would say that it seems that according to the proposal I made, there is no a full specifier in voice PP. There is more room for object shift or this type of movement operations in Catalan or other Romance languages, in the sense of being more prone to trying to move the object as a subject, as Jonathan suggests. But I have no insight.
Yeah.
On this. I mean, no
So the idea
particular
that animates would be in a different position than inanimate
Yeah.
or something.
I would say that I have the idea that I concur with those that think that DOM requires movement and movement to an external position, so they are type of subject. And I would say that maybe there is an interaction between voice not having a specifier and the possibility of moving objects in Catalan in those contexts in which voice is empty in the relevant sense. But I don't have any, of course, any idea about how to connect the facts yet. As for the first question, I think that's crucial. I had always problems reading Cinque 88 because I never got the judgments. So yeah, the inclusive reading, there is no inclusive reading in Spanish, right? The first person does not exist. So it's a different type of animal. We have sometimes the Romanists have the bad practice of just translate analysis to. Now, thanks to you, Paco, to Javi, to Jonathan, to Grant, we are starting to understand that there are different languages. And I think that Jonathan has already an answer for what is going on in Italian. I mean, well, he provides a suggestion, but I think that even in his approach to the issue, he can also play with the idea that in Italian, she or she is still a pronoun and it's different. And he also suggests it has more feature because it still it's not exactly aclitic in the technical sense, and blah, blah. And I would say exactly the same. I would say that since that Italian does not have C as a proof, Italian C is still a pronoun, and it is still a pronoun in object position, what is reflexive. Gianni si difende. I would say that they use impersonal pronouns in subject position, and they can co-occur. You can say ci si, right? Ci si, blah, blah, with the inclusive reading and so on. So I would say that the difference is that Italian is a language that doesn't have clitics as profs, on my account, right? And that's the idea. It's still in a diachronic point on an evolutionary stage in which pronouns are still pronouns. I would say that the difference is going, and I think that Jonathan is going to, I mean, we are more or less in the same line, right? The same page with respect to this aspect. I really concur with the idea that we have to really to see the difference between Romance and maybe other domains. We have to put the action in the makeup of pronouns, how pronouns evolve, maybe with cycles, as Jonathan suggests. And I think that Italian is a language which is in a previous stage of evolution. Basically, that's the idea. Just a brief note about secandamos construction, because in the north of Argentina, the construction still exists in some varieties. This was analyzed by a colleague from my country. You have construction like se fuimos, with I don't have the facts, the full paradigm, the full paradigm in my head. I think that there are predicate restriction, but yeah, they have still this construction suggesting that at least in some Spanish varieties there is pronominal counterpart of impersonal semi, right? So yeah, even in some old tango songs, you can hear the construction se fuimos. Many songs from the 30s or the 20s. Nice construction to say that.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to mention that Roberta in her book had the analysis of the first person plural as being, I don't know, Roberta is in YouTube, but being the, sort of an operator, having binding with that first person plural binding something in that empty category, just to mention that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I would also like to mention that this is 1986 arbitrary pro, which occurs in the object position. It's plural, right? So it could, okay, so it could be a pro that is plural that these languages have available, and it's occurring with impersonal C.
That's right.
Okay, so I think I'll ask you, Jonathan and Andres, for to say your final words, and after that, Abralin will end the transmission. So I want to thank you both for being here. I want to thank you, the discussants. I want to thank you, Roberto, who is not here but is here somehow. So, what you wanna say, and we will finish the transmission.
Well, thank you, Andres, Paco, Javier, Grant, Janina for setting this up. I think what I've taken away from this is that we're converging on some very interesting results, and I think there's more agreement than disagreement here, which is good, I say. So thank you, and feedback is always welcome.
Yeah, the same. I might surprise that maybe 5 years ago, Jonathan, Javi, Paco, and I were more in disagreement than now. And I think that that's real progress, because for instance, in my own research on this topic, I have learned a lot of funding by Javi, by Paco, by Lan, by Jonathan. I learned a lot of, I have to change my mind because of you guys. So I think that we all are starting to see that there are some patterns that receive a more or less reasonable answer with independence of technical implementation or whatever. I think that we are close we are close to get good description in the first place, and that's its progress. Maybe to have good answers also. So that's nice. That looks like science. And so thanks to my colleagues for that. Thanks and great huge to my dear friend Roberta, that she couldn't make it today, and to Yanaina and Abralin for this invitation. It was a tremendous pleasure to be with you guys today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I think we can finish, Abralin. We can stop the transmission.